My name is Bob Pearson, and we are right now in my house up at 223 South Rodney Street. This is right above the old South Central District. So we're right straight up above the library. My wife and I moved here in 1973 and have been really happy residents ever since. Over the course of that almost 50 years, there's been an awful lot that's happened. We've been involved with a lot of different kinds of things in the community around here, and it's been a great ride. We've really enjoyed the neighborhood, our neighbors, and the sort of the historic feel of the whole area. So it's been great. I think my wife has a great story about how she found this house. It was sort of her job when we first moved here. We were newlyweds. I had a job with the state legislature that was keeping me pretty busy, and she undertook the task of looking all around town to see what might be available as a place for us to live. And we had a certain not very fancy price range that we needed to look at. And so we were kind of concentrating on trying to find something in that price range, and she was being shown some of the options by the real estate agents, and they looked at something here in the neighborhood. I'm not sure what it was, but she looked up and saw a for sale sign at this house, and it has a pretty imposing look especially from Rodney Street. It's up with a pretty high retaining wall on the top, right on the top of the ridge, and with a fairly big side yard. And it was in June when everything was just all leafed out and is green and beautiful. And she said, "Oh my gosh, I could never afford anything like that, but if someday I could live in a place like that, I would be so happy." And so she tried to persuade the agent to show this house to her, and she had to work pretty hard at it because the agent really didn't want to show it. And perhaps there were a number of reasons for that. I mean, it was time worn and a bit hard used. I mean, there was a large family that lived here, and the house is very old, and so those kinds of things in a society that really reveres the new maybe didn't seem like really the kind of thing. Plus, the house didn't fit the description at all of what we thought we were looking for. Of course, because we figured that something small was about all we could afford at the time, and this was not small. So in any event, she eventually persuaded her to show her the house, and she looked at it and just fell in love with it. And we knew that there was a lot of work ahead if we were going to get it. But my father was an architect and came and looked at it and said that it was sound, and so there wasn't really any worry about the structural aspects of the house and so on. So some of the decorative work and things like that needed to be done could be done over time. And so we got it, and Tony in particular went to work. She spent a couple of years right here in this living room and dining room. There were about 7 layers of paint on every bit of woodwork in the house, and we kind of wanted to get it down to bare wood if we could, and because that was our preference at the time. We've since, I think, gained a greater degree of accommodation with the notion of painted woodwork, and we do have painted woodwork now, but she worked for months getting the paint off of that woodwork, and then we stained the woodwork in kind of a dark oak stain, and had that for most of the time that we lived here was actually like that. We redid the floors once, sanding them by hand and getting those all restored, and just worked our way through. Then we started on various other projects and hiring people to come in and do bigger projects. The middle of our house it was one of the 4 additions that were put onto it way in the early years that it was here, and we'll get to that maybe a little bit later. The history of it is interesting. And some of that wasn't, although the house doesn't seem to have been damaged whatsoever in the earthquakes, which maybe is because it's sitting on a ridge of bedrock, I don't know. But in any event, it seems to have survived that pretty well. But it was kind of amazing because part of this addition that's over here was actually a span with a brick veneer wall over it that was really not structurally supported at all. It almost looked like they had taken out a structural wall underneath it and not really redone it. So some of that kind of big work, we had to completely tear out some of the rooms and get that structural work redone and then rebuild the rooms themselves. So it took a number of years to get to all this, but we had promised ourselves when we got into it that we were not going to rush. We were going to be patient. And I think living in an old house requires a little bit of patience. It's a wonderful feeling these old houses have, but they do require a long view in order to keep them maintained and restore things that need to be fixed. There's no small project ever, as I found out, so we just tried to stick with it that way. As to the history of this house, there are several different kinds of versions about when it first was built. On the county records for the tax records and so forth, it says that it was built in 1870. On our historical survey work, it comes up with 1884. And then on the 1888 Sanborn maps, the house is here in exactly the same configuration it is now. So whatever happened in the early years, it's obvious just from looking at the construction and the way that the Sanborn map is drawn, both of those together, you can look at it and you can see that the front part of the house was built first as a separate unit. Then there was an addition put on the back that included what is now a dining room and kitchen. Then at some point, the front part of the house has a bay window, and a bay window addition was added to that second kind of T addition that had the dining room and kitchen in it. So that tended to push the house out toward the north, and that's where this unsupported span came into play. And that, I think, also at that time included a pantry addition to the kitchen area. And so then the fourth part that was added was a shed porch on the back that was originally apparently kind of a mudroom, and it had a little porch on the south side of the house with a doorway that went out. And in those early days, there was no plumbing, so that was where people went to go outside to the outhouse that was right on the property line back on the south side. So since all of that was that way, by 1888, if when the Atchison family moved in 1884, if they built the house and put all those additions on in those few years, I'd be surprised. So I do think at least part of it was here maybe earlier than what the historical surveys have shown so far. I'm trying to do a lot of research on this and find out the answer to some of these questions for sure, but as of today, I don't really completely know the answer to that. But anyway, as a result of the historical survey, we did decide to call this the John and Jenny Atchison House. And they had moved here. Their family was already intact when they moved to Helena. And I think one of the interesting things when you meet people around and say, especially when they're older and moved to Helena, well, what brought you here? I mean, we've had some sort of celebrity type people move here, and you say, well, how did you find Helena, and kind of what made you here? And you almost always find that it's a family connection. Nowadays, it's mostly there are grandchildren involved when some of the retired people move here. In the case of the Atchisons, it's interesting that Jenny's maiden name was Toole, and her father, Edwin W. Toole, had moved to Helena and was a fairly prominent lawyer here, and her brother, Joseph K. Toole, was one of the early territorial governors, and then later he was also elected governor. And I know that in one of the previous videos in this series, his home over across from the courthouse was discussed. But at the time that John and Jenny moved here, her brother lived just down on the corner of State and Rodney at 102 South Rodney, and her father sometimes lived there also, and sometimes lived close to there. So both Edwin and Joseph K. Toole lived in that house at different times. And like a lot of the early Helena people, in addition to the fact that John Atchison was a physician and surgeon and had an office down on Grand Street, he and his wife both did quite a bit of real estate speculation. And so you look around in the South Central neighborhood near where her brother lived, down State Street. She, at one point or another, owned and sold a number of those properties. They also seem to have bought a house, maybe before they bought this one, down on Breckenridge, and they owned properties out in Fergus County and so forth too. So they were pretty active people. Dr. Atchison became one of the first members of the state Board of Medical Examiners, and the governing body for physicians, and did quite a bit to work toward a higher professional standard for physicians in Montana. That was going on all across the country, but it was an important move that he made too. And they lived here until the late 1890s, at which point exactly what they did becomes a little bit confusing. Our historical survey indicated that he had died in 1898, but actually he left practice in Helena in 1898 and moved to Lewistown. And I'm not sure whether Jenny went with him to Lewistown right away or not. He was living in a boarding house there for the years that he was out in Lewistown, and for many of those years she had moved over to an apartment over on Ewing, and lived there for quite a number of years. And it indicates that he may have come back once in a while and lived there too, but I think he practiced in Lewistown pretty much until he died in 1911. And then Jenny lived on in Helena for a number of years after that, and I think died in the 30s. And her family stayed around Helena, and there are a number of different connections, and most of them were interred here when they eventually died. During the late part of or right around 1890, so perhaps it's better to say in the middle of their tenure here, China Clark, who was an extremely successful businessman, rancher, and so forth in the Helena area, decided, I think, to take part in the process of making Helena a much more grand place to live. And so right next door to this house, he built what many people know now as the Parchin Mansion, which was, for its time, absolutely the largest and most elegant mansion in town. It probably would have definitely held sway with any of the other mansions that were built after the sort of move from this side of town over to the near west side, which we think of as the Mansion District now. But because this was sort of the first real permanently developed area for the city after kind of coming up out of the gulch, it was regarded as a pretty fancy place still by about 1890, or at least had room for that at least. It was also where a lot of other people lived besides just the successful ones. But anyway, China Clark built this mansion. He was fairly advanced in age when he did, and his family, his children, and were all independent by that point. And his wife had died somewhat earlier, so it's a kind of a wonder that he did it. But here he built this magnificent mansion, and I think that he and the Atchisons got to know each other. I know that there were some connections there, but in any event, just about the same time as Atchison's left here, he died. And one or another of his children, his boys, young man, would live there with him on and off. But when he died, his will said that the thing was supposed to be turned into cash as soon as possible, and so that the kids were to take that and divide the money up evenly. So they were faced with the need to sell the house. And as it turned out, Henry Parchin, who was almost everybody knows the Parchin name in Helena, because he was also a very, very successful businessman. He started as a wholesale druggist, plus also retail drug, and he eventually was invested in almost every kind of property in Helena, and owned or had interests in a wide range of businesses. So he was very successful, and he had built for his wife. It's on the house down at the corner of Broadway and Rodney Street. It's on the southwest corner there, and he built that house for them. And his wife had some pretty important specifications that were built into it. Like, she wanted to make sure the upstairs was not confined by the roof. So it had to have a full upstairs, and then the attic could have the roof over it. And her nephew eventually lived up in the attic for a while. People are interested in this. There's an excellent novel about Emma Parchin that a local Helena author wrote, and it's well worth everybody reading. It's a historical novel, so not every event is actually provable, but it's all plausible, and the core of the history of that family is right. But anyway, around the turn of the 20th century, then this Clark Mansion was available, and the Parchins decided that they would take it over And so they moved up from their own home and moved in about 1904 to the Clark Mansion, and they lived in it for the next number of years. They lived the rest of their lives there, and so it became known as the Parchin Mansion. And I know that there are a number of different social events that are reported. The newspapers used to really cover everything, and social events were one of the things that were big. And the Parchin children and the Atchison children often were showing up in the same events and so forth in those early days. So there was a lot of connection there. I think they were Adele Parchin was quite a musical young lady. She was a singer and played. And one of the girls that lived in this house was a violinist. And it looks to me like they did some getting together and doing that, as well as other just kind of children's parties and things like that. But at the same time that the Parchins bought that property, they also bought this property. In the early, well-to-do families, or even middle-class families, back in those days, before there were household conveniences relatively available, very often had servants. Now, and however many servants you had probably was related to how wealthy you were. But certainly to run one of those big mansions was not something that you could do as a hobby. And so for all those people that had those big mansions, they also had servants. And when we moved in here, the neighborhood banter was that this house had been a servant's quarters for the mansion for a long time. And I had never realized that the Parchins actually had bought it at that time. But that kind of gave some credence to this idea that it might well have been for that. And maybe it was. But there's no strong direct evidence I have for that. And if it was true that they had bought it for that purpose, they didn't use it that way for very long, because very soon after they bought it, within a couple of years after they bought it in 1904, a family moved in here called the Hindleys, and they rented this house until 1911 or so. And Reverend Dr. Hindley was a congregational pastor here in Helena, and he lived here with his whole family and his mother and other people. So it was and his family was fairly ample, so it was a full house. And Reverend Hindley was one of the things that makes him historically really interesting, aside from just having been a real active minister here in town, was that he was really interested in prison reform. And the history of Montana prisons sort of follows the history of a lot of other places back in those days. And reform was something that was probably pretty necessary, because one of the kinds of things that went on is they were sort of run as private fiefdoms by the warden, who would earn money by putting the prisoners to work. And anyway, there were a lot of people that just felt that the prison system was inhumane at that time, and Reverend Hindley was one of the ones. So that family stayed here, rented here for a few years, and then he suddenly died, and for whatever reason, the family didn't stay here any longer. They moved over to the new Broadwater area, and they lived over there, and that began a series of different people living here as renters until the Parchin, and that continued people staying here shorter and longer times. The house was never really subdivided like modern apartment house would be, but rooms, individual rooms were rented out sometimes. Different parts of the house were rented out. And so there were a number of different people over the years who lived here until the Parchin interest sold the house in 1945. So they owned it for a very long time, and kept it in pretty good shape during that whole time. Mrs. Parchin died in 1915, and Mr. Parchin died in 1925. And as he grew older, starting about 1920, he and his daughter in particular, but other members of the family too, would do like probably a lot of a little bit better off Montanans like to do in those days, and that was to go to California for the winter. And they go to Southern California, and I know Charlie Russell did that, and it was a very popular thing for Montanans to do, and certainly the Parchins did that. And Henry Parchin and his daughter Adele, who never married, regularly were spending more and more time in California every winter. Two of her brothers ended up buying a ranch over near Polson, which they owned and managed for a number of years. And so they were absent from Helena quite a bit, running their ranch over there. And so in the 20s, during the shorter periods of time in the summer when Adele and her father were here, it was just the two of them in that big mansion. So once again, here's this very large mansion with just a couple of people in it. And then when Henry Parchin died in 25, Adele was really the only one left there in that house, considering it as a residence, and she was spending more and more time in California in the winter, and then with her brothers over at a home on their ranch in the summertime on Flathead Lake, and actually the home I think was right on Finley Point. And so, what to do with the mansion? And they offered that mansion to the Masonic bodies as a potential home for the widows of Masons who needed a place to live. But after the panic of 1893 and the subsequent depression that happened across the country, it hit Montana hard, and when you look at a lot of the different things that were going on in the early part of the 20th century here, it was just really, really tough. And it never did really get better until after World War II. And so things were just kind of going along, and not too much was happening. And you could tell the Masonic bodies were feeling the pressure too, and they could not afford to take over that mansion as a gift. And so after several years of working with them, and the Parchin family were members of the Masonic bodies, so they really did try. So anyway, in 1931, the Parchin interests decided that they should sell the house, and some people were interested in looking at it through an agent, but the agent, after having visited with them, decided that they didn't have enough money to even pay the low price that was being asked, and he just decided not to deal with them. And their names were Steck and Stevens, these two men that were involved in it at the time. And Leonard Steck, who was one of them, had been an employee of one of the Parchin businesses, and he kind of knew him. So he went to Henry M. Parchin Jr., who was handling the matters at the time, in about April, and he made a direct deal with him to buy it. And so it was kind of, as well as I can figure out, they did a contract for deed. And so he became the owner of the property based on a down payment of $1,000 against the $6,500 that they agreed on that he would buy it for. And the papers then show that Adele, who had, as I say, once in a while been living there, moved over to the Blackstone Apartments. That was kind of an upscale apartment house in those days, and took an apartment there. And she was quite an entertainer, and so she shows up a lot in terms of all these things she's doing. She's singing for the church here, singing at the synagogue, having parties, guests coming, relatives and other guests coming from California and stuff. And so that moves from the mansion over to the Blackstone Apartments and all of that. And you can kind of follow that through. So by May, this house has been vacated, this mansion has been vacated, and Leonard Steck is the ostensible owner of it. Then at the end of September, I think the 28th of September that year, 31, the house goes up in flames. And it's just an absolutely phenomenal roaring blaze. And a lady down the street who has other relatives up here, right over on Spencer Street anyway. I mean, the whole community, this whole neighborhood is constantly always connected. And the more names you find out, the more relatives you find, that's how it's all connected. But anyway, this Mrs. Cratcher, who lived just down approximately where the May Butler School is, woke up with the smell of smoke in about 2:30 in the morning, and she called the fire department, and they came up, but they were able to get the fire out, but it was a pretty spectacular blaze anyway. And the very next morning, the fire chief made the determination that it was an arson fire. And they had gotten the fire out enough that there were actually, it wasn't just, detecting vapors or anything like that. They actually found the physical evidence of gas cans and where fuel had been poured on the stairway, all up the stairways and everything else. So it was no doubt an arson, despite the fact that there were interviews with a couple of neighbors that had been engaged to look after it, who really weren't sure that that actually was an arson themselves, because they had seen people go, they'd had to chase people out of the building and different things. So they thought maybe somebody was just, hobos is one of the terms they used, were camping in the basement and maybe they started the fire. Anyway, that wasn't the case. It was clearly arson. So they had the case, and then it was thought that Leonard Steck had been out of town, or was still in California this time, because he had been on a long trip down there. But it turned out the next morning after the fire, the authorities see him walking down Broadway to downtown, and they know who he is and that he was involved in looking after the house. So they begin to ask him what he knows about maybe what went on. And in his pockets are two fairly large fire insurance policies on the house. Well, it's not unusual that he would own fire insurance policies on a house that he had bought, but still it looked a little bit peculiar because the total value of the fire insurance was like $40,000, where he had only paid, or only agreed to pay $6,500. And as far as I can tell, he'd only made the first $1,000 payment. So it was reasonable, I think, for the authorities to imagine that perhaps he was going to use these insurance policies to get a little bit of a profit on this purchase instead of having a burden of maintaining a mansion. So in any event, years later, I was visiting with my father-in-law at a club that he belonged to in Redwood City, California. And he took me to lunch there, and one of the other gentlemen that was a member came and sat and had lunch with us. And we were bantering about, that I was from Helena and so on. And he said, "Oh, I grew up in Helena, Montana." I said, "Oh, where did you grow up?" And he said, "Oh, down on 5th Street." And I said, "Oh, I know where that is. I used to live, for a while, I lived just on Breckenridge, pretty close to there." And I said, I live up on South Rodney now, right next to the old Parchin Mansion. I said, "You probably knew about that." And he just turned white as a ghost. And he said, "Oh, I do." He said, "I was just going into the insurance business in those days, and I sold one of the policies on that house right before it was burned down." And so I thought, well, this is an interesting coincidence. But any event, that's just a little sidelight. But anyway, this Leonard Steck had these policies in his pocket, and he was fairly quickly charged with the arson because he had access to it, he had the policies, he had motive, all this, and so they charged him with arson. But at the same time, the other person that he had been engaged with, Stevens, was Charles Stevens, ended up in another related story in which he was reported as having gone out to the York Bridge and gone up on the railing and shot himself and fell into the river, a suicide. And he had paid a young man to drive him out there who told the story. And the authorities spent the weekend trying to drag the river and find him and everything else. And then they decided that the whole thing was a put-up job and that he had not really committed suicide at all, but had done it to hide his tracks and get away. And, it came out that there was some kind of a connection there between him and Steck, because they had been the two people that had tried to buy the house that the real estate agent didn't want to deal with anymore. So he disappears. And pretty soon they decide that they don't have enough evidence to convict Steck, but that this Stevens must have been involved in some way. And then it turns out that Stevens' brother, Charles, files a lawsuit claiming that he's the one that should get that he really owned the house, that Leonard Steck had bought the house as his agent, and that he was the one who really owned it and should get the insurance money for the loss. And so this lawsuit is going on against, to claim title. The court should give him the title and the money from the insurance. So that goes on and off for about 5 years, and his brother's a fugitive. So finally in 1935, they find the brother in Butte, and he's called, they call him in the Butte paper, Helena's public enemy #1. And they bring him back to Helena and charge him with the arson. Meanwhile, his brother's lawsuit isn't going so well. He loses it, goes to the Supreme Court, gets thrown out of the Supreme Court. And I haven't yet found out what eventually, whether he just dropped it at that point or if he tried to go back to the court and got thrown out there or not. But anyway, nothing ever came of that. And after they charged Charles with the arson, the judge threw that out because he said they didn't have enough evidence. So we have this whole convoluted mystery story, all these in and outs and people going back and forth and everything else to try to solve this mystery of who burned down the Parchin Mansion, and ultimately nobody was convicted of anything. And meanwhile, it seems as if a man named Donaldson and his wife actually became the owners of the property. And so, because by the middle of 1931, or 32, I guess, the year after the fire anyway, Mrs. Donaldson gets a building permit, or a demolition permit, for her husband to do work to demolish what's left of the mansion. So the ruins were still standing at that point, and so he got that, and there's a little house that's right out here that was probably there before the mansion was built, but in any event, it was a part of the property, and he and his wife lived there for a number of years after that. And they knocked the mansion down. And the main thing that was ever kept from that, they did not dispose of a lot of the sandstone, decorative stone that was used in the building of it. And if you look at an old picture of the building, you can see that the corners of the building, the lintels, the sides of the windows and everything were all of this carved sandstone. The rest was brick. So that sandstone was left on the property for all the years. And when Don and Jeannie Pullen, who by the 70s owned the property and built their house there, they built their fireplace and another water fountain feature, bird feeder, I think, on their lot with using that leftover sandstone. So there's still an echo of the old Parchin Mansion in the house, the newer house that's at that location now. It was built in 75. So that's kind of, and then it was in 1945 that the Parchin interests sold the last bit of their stake in this part of the South Central neighborhood, when they sold our property to the Kircher family. And Conrad Kircher and Catherine Kircher owned this place for about 13 years after that. And they one of the interesting things they did is that when their daughter was married, they had the wedding right here in this living room. And we have a bay window that is just to my left here, and so the newspaper description of the wedding showed that they had put up all of the kind of wedding decorations in front of that, and then that's where they had the wedding. And the guest list is like a neighborhood residency list. I mean, once again, all of the neighbors were interactive with each other and very close. And the Kircher family lived here for about 13 years and sold it to the DeHarts, who lived here for another 13, 15 years till we bought it. And so we've actually owned and lived in the house longer than any other individuals since that I've been able to discover since the place was built. And it's it's a joy, because being up on the top of the ridge and at the angle that we are, we can watch the sunrise over the big belts, the sunset over Mount Helena, look out all the way out to the Lake Helena from our upstairs windows, and also survey the historic part of downtown. So it's a great and wonderful place to live, connected with history, but as far as a great place to live today, it's close to downtown, close to all of the other features of Helena. I was able to walk to work at the Capitol for my whole career over there. We always enjoyed the South Central business district down on Rodney Street. The old stories of the Rodney Street neighborhood just go on and on, but it's just great.